When Gandhi was asked once to comment on European civilization, his quip was, "It would be a very good idea." When asked today about our views on the European Union, I think we can be excused to reply in a similar fashion. What a splendid idea it would be if we could only pull it off. United only in name, the European Union is, I'm afraid, in a process of disintegration as we speak. With the commitment and determination of a termite colony which is eating into the foundations, very soon there will be nothing left but an empty shell to remind us of the lofty ideal that used to be the European Union. In Agatha Christie novels, when the reader comes across, in the prologue, a group of characters, upper-class characters usually, that are congregating some chateau, the reader knows what to expect: a series of murders. Similarly today, when we hear that our European politicians are gathering today, or together, we know what to expect: a comedy of errors, which will be wrapped up in triumphant rhetoric, but which very soon will prove to be nothing more than dangerous, harmful waffle. To err is human. But to mess up spectacularly, we need an elite made up of prime ministers, presidents, ministers, apparatchiks, opinion makers, who are determined not to face up to a systemic crisis systematically. Alas, at least now we have enough evidence that renders all such denial inexcusable. Humanity has not surprised itself very often, but it has done so twice in the past. Once in 1929, and yet again, more recently in 2008. 1929 ought to have taught us a very simple binary twin lesson. First, that the first victim of such a crisis is the common currency. It was a gold standard in 1929, it is the euro today. The second victim is, of course, truth and civility. Once such a terrible crisis hits the world, a Hobbesian war of all against all is unleashed on an unsuspecting humanity. And the first victim is our capacity to recognize the systemic crisis we are in as a systemic crisis. And therefore, it renders us incapable of accepting our responsibility for at least a portion of that crisis. Thrillers begin with some cunning detective who is unmasking one shady character after the other. But good thrillers, I submit to you, do not end with the unveiling of the perpetrator. They go one step further. They reach the momentous moment when the cunning detective inadvertently unmasks himself. Bewildered, he's staring at his own image in the mirror. This crisis is having a similar effect on all of us. Our masks are falling. Unscrupulous bankers, inane politicians, conniving entrepreneurs, cynical academics, uncritical citizens, who are all being unmasked. But as their masks keep falling, the dejection is becoming generalized. Meanwhile, the human costs are mounting up. And the only way of making sense of them and measuring them sensibly is by means of counting lost generations. It is time to transform Europe and to be transformed in the process. Now, the medical profession only very recently managed to save more people than it killed. Up until the 1920s or so, the disease was preferable to the cure. Similarly, with the euro crisis now, our European leaders are enacting what I call a poisonous medicine. Toxic bailouts, inane austerity, we created in order to salvage a euro system, a currency union which was never designed to sustain the catastrophe of 2008, the shock waves of that great earthquake. What we've done is we've created a scaffold which is, instead of helping the edifice from collapsing, it is putting more pressure on it. We've created this European financial stability or instability facility, and we modeled it, we created it in the image of Lehman Brothers' infamous derivatives. It was as if we took two stones and we tied them together by means of a string, hoping they will float more readily. The result, of course, is the uncontrolled disintegration that we're experiencing. Now, by now, most people are realizing this. So what we have is a new Jerusalem that is being canvassed. It comes in the form of the so-called federal option. Well-meaning Europeans and some friends from further afield recite this litany of federal concepts, ideas, suggestions. I'll just give you some. We hear of the importance of forging a fiscal or a transfer union in Europe, of having a federal treasury, of giving a new Leviathan, a new economic czar, the power to rule over all of us with an iron fist and keep us in awe. We hear about a centralized disposal of national assets, particularly of the Greek kind. The loss of national sovereignty as a price we have to pay for this fiscal union. And of course, the dreaded treaty changes that have to go through 27 parliaments or electorates. I submit to you that this is both unworkable and undesirable. Why is it unworkable? Because, and this is a message to federalists, the worst enemy of federalism at the moment is itself. And the reason why I'm saying is this because if we move in the federalist direction, the crisis is certain to outpace us. It will run faster than we do. And when the treaty changes take longer than the collapse of the euro, all we will be left with is the smoldering mess in which there will be nothing left to federate. But there is a second reason why this federal option needs to be shunned. And it is that if the United States of Europe is a good idea, it is not an idea that should be wasted and subsumed in the context of trying to solve the current crisis. Let me put it very simply. The federal option will only be possible once the crisis is over, not as an antidote to the crisis. We will only be capable and worthy of federation when, as Europeans, we can imagine a future in which Greeks and Germans will be voting in Greek and German politicians to represent us. We will only be able to effect a decent federal Europe when we can imagine a situation where our national armies are dissolved and are merged into a common European defense force. We are only going to be able to put together a decent federation if we can imagine a situation where our views are assessed within Europe on the basis of their merits and demerits alone, what the ancient Athenians used to refer to as isigoria, as opposed to judging what somebody says on the basis of who they are, what accent they speak in, which country they come from. And finally, at a symbolic but a very important level, let me say this. We're only going to be capable of a proper federation when we can decide as Europeans what to print on our euro notes instead of these abstract bridges and gates that symbolize one thing, our incapacity to agree on common symbols. So if I'm right that the New Jerusalem is not really New Jerusalem and that it is putting forward an unworkable and undesirable idea, which will also lead to uncontrolled disintegration, then what is the alternative? Well, let me suggest to you that before we agree on an alternative, perhaps we should agree on some shared principles that should govern our future. These principles may well seem seemingly contradictory, but they can be rendered harmonious, and if they can't, then we have no future. Let me give you examples. One principle is that I think we should end the perfectly partitioned Europe that we created Maastricht in order to create the euro. While at the same time, however, strengthening national sovereignty and empowering national responsibility within that model. Another set. And the pseudo-solidarity which is being imposed upon the Dutch and the Germans in order to give bailouts, pretend bailouts to the Greeks and to the Irish. Stop inane austerity, which is only making the debt crisis worse. ignore all the calls for debt buyouts, buybacks, which will not work, but at the same time integrate investment and the management of our problems, like existing debt and banking losses. This is what I refer to as decentralized Europeanization, so allow me an acronym. Decent Europe. Europeanize what? 3 realms. We need a management of existing debt at the European level. We need management of the banking sector, which is collapsing all over us. And we need a Europeanized investment policy in aggregate. How do we do this without treaty changes and federation? We already have existing institutions in Europe, and each one of them can be assigned one of these tasks. I'm not going to go into this. This is not the place or the time. You can see more of this proposal elsewhere. All I want to do now is to give you a flavor of what the whole purpose of this is. Decentralized Europeanization creates the circumstances for national sovereignty and national responsibility to be strengthened, because if we integrate these 3 spheres in Europe of the existing debt, of banks and investment flows, then at the national level, each member state can run a balanced budget, can learn to live within its means, and also to be empowered within these limits to exercise a full national sovereignty. So I present this distant Europe proposal to you as, if you want, a forger of a future federation's prerequisites, which I've already mentioned, and I won't mention again. Let me finish by reminding you of a myth, according to which Sibyl of Cumae offered Tarquinius Superbus, the king of Rome at the time, the 9 books of wisdom at a price that Tarquinius considered to be exorbitant, and therefore he said no to the offer. Sibyl, as you all know, started burning one of these volumes after the other, until Tarquinius relented, agreeing to pay the original high price for the remaining 3 volumes. Let me suggest that the European crisis is following Sibyl's strategy. The problem is that our European leaders keep saying no, and therefore threatening to allow our common heritage to burn in its entirety. Decentralized Europeanization offers Europe a chance to save its last 3 books of wisdom, or the equivalent. It offers us a chance to usher in a new era in which Europeans, northern and southern, western and eastern, can stare into each other's eyes and see and recognize a partner. If we miss this chance, then Europe is going to be dragging the whole planet into a despicable mire for a 3rd time in a century. It is our duty and overarching obligation to prevent this. Thank you.